that last presentation kind of really shows my point, and that all it takes is putting a little bit of data out there, and then you see how many transactions started to take place as a result of that data. But I'm also going to, while making it a statement, I'm also more posing this as a question. Because while it's a statement I believe, and I think at TrueCar we've certainly seen this play out in automotive, I'd be curious on your experiences too. For those that don't know what TrueCar is, we're a 10-year-old company. We're a marketplace that helps people buy and sell cars. Yes, we deal with, I guess if you want to call it, Internet of Things. We help people actually move physical assets. But ultimately, we don't have any physical locations. We don't run dealerships. We don't run manufacturing lines or anything. We simply provide data to and from various places, and that ultimately is what is exchanged. So to give you a sense of the automotive industry, because I don't think, and maybe this probably isn't totally indicative of all of it, but to give you a sense of what we're talking about and why TrueCar was so exciting to me to join from all these other things that I've done. It's just a massive marketplace when you add it all up, and I'm probably missing a few $100 billion. But you're talking about over $1 trillion for just the U.S. market, much less the international markets. And what my point about data is the only marketplace, if I tease apart every single one of these categories that we're talking about of assets, the last three should be financing and extended warranties should be somewhat obvious that those are just pure data things. They're not even real physical assets in any fashion. New car and used car sales, well, most people don't actually hand cash over to each other, so usually those are based on loans and leases and future financial derivatives, etc. Accessories and equipment, I suppose, depending on how much you believe your LoJack is doing anything physically useful for you, I suggest it's purely a data exchange. So TrueCar itself, to give you a sense of really what our footprint is and why I use big words like unprecedented and everything that everybody's presented, I think there's some pretty unprecedented stuff here. But as far as an industry like automotive, and I think some people in this room probably know this, it's probably harder to crack than government as far as getting at data. And I think TrueCar probably has the largest data footprint, having brought together obviously an open consumer channel and our TrueCar brand, but ultimately we have 139 partners across various things: insurance, banks, finance, what we consider member organizations like AARP, and then publishers, and then employee benefits programs. All strategically chosen for where they actually fall in the marketplace, and obviously all are about exchanging data to make things happen. Total actual consumer footprint is about 6 million plus car shoppers and buyers. So it's pretty big, and then 11,000 TrueCar certified dealers, which if you want to know what the U.S. market is, about 32,000 franchise dealers. There's probably 40,000 independent dealers, but some of those are pure data concepts because you can't even find them on Google Maps sometimes. I'm not sure they exist. But 11,000 with 1/3 of the actual dealer network in the U.S. is a pretty big footprint. So what do we actually do? When I'm talking about exchanging all this data, we have three major categories of data exchange that I want to talk about. Obviously, the acquisition, wherever the consumer is, wherever they're shopping, bring them into the service. Then there's this idea of conversion, so taking someone from purely being a shopper into actual buyer, or in case of trade, a trader, whatever it is. So two paths, new car or a used car. And all along the way, you're getting various data exchanges happening. You select a vehicle, you look at the marketing materials, you get pricing confidence and valuation, you get a sense of the coverage of where the dealer network is, etc. And then ultimately, you do end up at a dealership to actually pick up the vehicle. Currently in the U.S., you really can't go direct. You have to go through a dealer. I don't know if everybody knows that, but the laws are fairly forbidding on how you can actually operate, which is sort of an interesting 100-year-old thing that hopefully over time will change so that people can actually interact much more easily. But the idea is even at the dealership, there's a massive data exchange that happens. And I would say this last part is where TrueCar is really focused on cracking this data exchange, because I'm sure most of you know, if you've bought a car in the United States, it ends up being a fairly black box affair. And we lose a lot of data visibility as soon as you enter that dealership. But it's getting better with mobile and more real-time event tracking, which is a good thing. So, I'll say, and I don't know, again, how many people know about TrueCar or our place in the industry, but for a while there, we were getting dinged on the idea of price, and that we were driving price as a race to the bottom, which is simply not actually true when you look at the data. It took on way too much credit. It turns out price is more of a metadata point that when you look at it, it's really just measuring a bunch of other things that are going on. So what are those kind of things that we're dealing with in terms of the data, the actual stuff? And I'm not going to read through everything on here, but it's fairly comprehensive. So in terms of the consumer experience, we currently have 24 million consumer profiles that we've built up over the last 10 years of people going through our platform and our network. We're kind of ambiently tracking over 116 million car shoppers. We view everybody who's of legal age and has a driver's license of being a car shopper. They're just at a different point in the life cycle there. And then in terms of the industry data that we see, and you probably could question my 100% thing, because I don't really believe you could ever achieve 100% of anything, any particular data set, but if you could, we're probably the furthest along. So we believe we're seeing the majority of inventory, so vehicle data on vehicles that are actually on the ground. OEM incentives, so that's them giving you either the dealer or you, a consumer, a discount on the car, on that price. Configurator and pricing data, which you saw some of that in the keynote, when Dr. Wolfen brought up the actual auto data. Most of that was being shown was the vehicle configurations and the MSRP. Obviously, the world goes much deeper than that, and it's just a really gnarly ontology, if you want to think about it that way. And then what kind of is underneath all that is this idea of what's called build data. And this will get a little more into why I say data is the only marketplace. Build data is actually what they put on the car. So that fidelity of that data gets lost very, very quickly in the life cycle of an actual vehicle. So what happens in many cases is the OEM manufactures the vehicle. They somewhere in some database somewhere, they actually type out or whatever they do what's actually on this vehicle. Obviously, it got a VIN assigned to it, a vehicle identification number. And all the cost data and everything is based on that actual what was put on the vehicle. Well, okay, the car gets shipped off to whatever dealer. It might, if it has to go through a port, the port might install options. These are port installed options. They don't go back and edit the database at the OEM to tell you what they installed on it. And then it ends up at a dealer. And again, if you've shopped for cars in the US, dealers also do dealer installed options, which is all very fine and dandy. I'm sure you all have bought something with a dealer installed option on it. The problem is the data isn't captured consistently anywhere, and the real issue when you talk about something like price is that you literally cannot print prices. You cannot do it. It's illegal to print prices if you're not accurate. So it's a huge problem when I'm telling you 3 points, and these aren't the only 3 points, where you lose sight of the actual asset you're dealing with. And if you're not keeping track of a port installed option or a dealer option, it's not like that's a $2 swing. That could be a $5,000 swing. Then if you include tax, title, and license, those are all different by different jurisdictions, different states, different cities, all have their ways in which they're going to get money out of you. And again, I think the last presentation was really funny about how little hidden things that are based on data, 20% here, depending on tax, surcharge, those things actually exist in droves in automotive all over the place. Little things you don't know you're paying for. That actually, if you tease apart and you say, what is this actually? What is this? What is this? The last 2 years has grown quite a bit, and I'm pretty excited about because I think data grows. The biggest data set, which over the last 2 years has grown quite a bit, and I'm pretty excited about because I think data grows. The biggest data set, which over the last 2 years has grown quite a bit, and I'm pretty excited about because I think data grows as your business grows when you're making claims like I am. We've actually grown from about 20 gigabytes of data to over a petabyte in a little over 2 years, which is fantastic. And most of that data is just behavioral data, which is really interesting because I could tell you about the ontology of the industry, which is all this who, what asset, where people are located, where dealers are located. But really the key thing for what I'm talking about, a marketplace, is actually who's exchanging what with whom and how much is it valued. That's really the key stuff that we've been putting together. So I'll give you a little, just because this is what this is, we're exchanging data so that you'll believe what I'm telling you. Just a little bit more about these data points. So we value over 200 billion possible vehicle combinations a day. It's a pretty, that's a rough estimate because I don't know how to correctly calculate every possible option, tax, title, license, because all that could change based on where the vehicle moves, etc. We're tracking about 65 billion events every single day. We've processed over 1 billion vehicle images. I believe we have the largest vehicle image data set that has been highly trained for doing vehicle recognition just from a single image. Obviously all the car profiles, all the VINs that are moving around every single day. And ultimately beyond the data that we're sourcing directly from a consumer, we actually have 12,000 different third-party data feeds coming in that are non-standardized. And trust me, this industry is about as crazy it gets in terms of data formats. So let's get into my premise here a little bit, which is, let's just talk about something I think we all can kind of common sense, talk about. What is price? If you ask people that work at a dealership or whatever, they'll give you kind of the colloquial version of this. Well, it's whatever someone's willing to pay for something. I'm sure if you've gone to a dealer, that's your experience of price, right? Hey, well, how much you got? Well, okay. Yeah, I get it. So that's what somebody's willing to offer in exchange for something else. Ultimately, for TrueCar, if you want to measure the values of things over time and be able to predict those things, etc., this definition of price really is just a historical artifact. It's what happened in a transaction. Well, this starts to get a little metaphysically weird when you start thinking about markets, stock markets, and vehicle markets and things like this. And I could talk about weirder markets like selling compute cycles and things like that, where price becomes very bizarre in how you actually quantify it and tie it to something in the real world. So when we say price before a transaction occurs, what are we really talking about? And I don't quite have a great definition for this. I think the definition comes out through an experience with the data, and it's probably different for each one of us, which I know, again, is a very bizarre notion. But the idea here is that we give you, if you've ever been on TrueCar and you saw it in an earlier slide where we give you a little bit of distribution of the transaction prices that happened in your local area for that car that you are looking at, we've synthesized a bunch of data, we've imputed a bunch of things, and then ultimately we say, look, these are the transactions that have happened in your area. So we're not saying this is the exact price you should pay. Instead, we're saying, look, it should be in this range somewhere. So it is sort of putting guardrails on actually what these prices should be. I don't know exactly how you want to define that, and I think dealers will have a different perception of that than OEM people. And to give you a sense of that, MSRP, I get into all these discussions with people because, again, I go, what is an MSRP? Well, that's a suggested price. Of course, the OEM's MSRP suggested price is much higher than, say, the consumer suggested retail price, which, right, so you're really, what you're trying to do in these data exchanges is bring everybody closer, right? And that's really the role of TrueCar. Let's get everybody's expectation a little more aligned so that there's less stress. And then ultimately, I even call into question the definition of someone. When you go to the dealership, it's rarely, in fact, I think the stat is it's 75% of people go to the dealership with another person. It's called a third baseman in the industry, and they really hate that because usually you bring a negotiator with you because you're going to get ganged up on or whatever it is, and so you bring a third party. Usually it's your pal or someone that's convinced you they're really good at negotiating, whether that's true or not. So when you're dealing with someone, the dealer's actually prepared to deal with the third baseman, not the actual person who's going to be signing the papers. Then when you think about the someone that the papers And what I mean by papers, it's the financial information, the loan or the lease or whatever. That definition of a someone is very different than that someone who's sitting across the table from the dealer. That someone is a number or a set of numbers, a risk analysis of whether this person can pay for this car, et cetera, et cetera. And if you're wondering, if that's me making that stuff up, no, it has real value. That's, hundreds of billions of dollars go into that assessment of that person that has nothing to do with that actual person sitting at the table. That's the insurance risk models and things like that. So really, when you're talking about the final value of a deal, it's actually data that's been exchanged. So, kind of how do we think about putting this all together? A couple simple statements, I suppose, but hopefully they're meaningful. The more data, the more that we can determine. Again, I don't think we can achieve 100% perfection, so that's why price is not, to me, a discrete, you get the answer right, here it is. It's much more of a moving target, but you can be more confident in that price, more confident in all these exchanges, the more data that you have. I think it goes back to one of the earlier talks today where the question came up about data truth versus the shades of gray, and I really personally believe, and I've seen it through TrueCar, that really everything is a shade of gray. I think about the exoplanet stuff and things like that, and I think we can say those are exoplanets, but until we visit the planet, we don't really know how accurate our assessment is. And I think this is to my point in here. So we really just believe the more you accumulate, the more we can determine. Price is just one data point, but there's a lot that goes in there. And I kind of measure, and maybe this is weird in some of my Wolfram alumni background, but I'm measuring our ability to determine things by how much data we have. I can't quite come up with a better measure than that. So right now we have about a petabyte. I don't think that's enough to do everything we want to do, but it's certainly growing, and that's good. And then if you want to think about it, and I think other people have mentioned other industries, but really every industry is supported by the data exchange. Again, I think that last talk was great. How many weird little things change simply because you publish descriptive statistics, and you really changed materially taxi cabs, annual salaries and things like that simply by publishing data. And it really is the thing that moves things. Then you get into this, so let's extend this a little bit, because I was having a conversation at lunch with a couple people, and it was interesting because the question is always, can you ever get to 100% data fidelity and data clarity on these things? I think the answer is no, because as soon as you think you got there, something changes. Even in an industry 100 years old, we have these little cars driving around, mapping the world, and ultimately, I don't know if it's Google, but enough people will send out these cars that are self-driving, if you believe that's even possible. I don't know if it is. I'm not yet ready to get in one and entrust my life to that little thing driving around. But if I could make a case that was very straightforward than the metaphysical things I was saying, there's nothing more data-driven that I can think of than that thing and you inside of it, letting it drive you around the world. This changes the entire automotive market if this becomes a major mode of transportation for obvious reasons. All those categories of the $1 trillion that is in there. I mean, insurance is based on the idea of the person driving the car. So now I don't know where insurance as a business actually goes in this world. We've already seen some of that disruption in how do you actually insure an Uber driver and a car that's being employed in the use of Uber. I think it's a super weird thing. And luckily, here's my whole self-fulfilling premise. The answer to these questions are only going to be found in more data. So I really feel like we have to build the biggest data platform. And again, another proof point, I don't know how many people know this, but 3 OEMs just got together and spent $3 billion to buy the Nokia Maps division, which is a really interesting thing when you think about OEMs. I think they realized we can't let Google and Apple have all the data. We're going to have to start owning all this mapping data ourselves if this is the reality of where cars are going. Maybe I'm misreading that, but I thought that was a very expensive purchase of a pure data asset. So a couple points on this to kind of tie it all together, and these are products obviously that people in here are familiar with, but they're really to the point that I'm trying to tie everything to. That you got to get this idea that data, you got to have enough data to be material. You got to be able to identify what you're dealing with, and however you want to say that. And I think the last 2 talks ago kind of talked about classification and different ways of doing that. And then ultimately, you got to have the context. All of these are data concepts, but I think these things really only come together and fulfill the premise I'm saying about data as a marketplace when you have those three those three things in place. And I think we're going to see more and more of these. I don't know what you call these things because they're not pure programming. They're not pure data. There's some weird hybrid thingy that sits in the middle of them. And I think that's why we've, my experience from spending the first year of Wolfram Alpha trying to talk to people through it is it's a very difficult system to talk to an average business about. And even what I'm saying with TrueCar, try explaining what I'm trying to build at TrueCar to a dealer who's been selling cars for 30 years. They don't exactly think of what they're selling as a data exchange. So, if I were to bring it all around, and I could just keep saying that this is a very self-recursive cycle here, where every industry has many conclusive data points until they aren't conclusive. Then they go exploit new opportunities, and this just keeps feeding itself over and over and over again. And I think many of you are in those kind of businesses or those organizations. So obvious examples, where it's just obvious that this is a pure data exchange. And I could go on to state, things like Amazon is a great example to me of like, you start by selling books, you end up building the world's biggest cloud platform, you end up making $7 billion doing that. You end up running drone businesses now and shooting rockets into space. Amazon can only do that because it ultimately was a giant data business that we're all giving our data to every single day, etc. So I could keep pulling examples out like this. So, questions about anything? I don't know if I've made the case. I hope I've asked the question that in the end, I think if it's not true today that every marketplace is a data marketplace, I'm pretty certain that's mostly what we're all going to be exchanging in a very obvious way.